telecomp was empty when she came into the room. The consoles and teleprinters stood silently, the screens blinking up random sequences of numbers. She went to the corner and poured herself a cup of coffee, then fed the test card from Benson's latest Psychodex into the computer. The NPS had developed the Psychodex test, along with several other computer-analyzed psychological tests. It was all part of what McPherson called double-edged thinking. In this case, he meant that the idea of a brain being like a computer worked two ways, in two different directions. On the one hand, you could utilize the computer to probe the brain, to help you analyze its working. At the same time, you could use your increased knowledge of the brain to help design better and more efficient computers. As McPherson said, the brain is as much a model for the computer as the computer is a model for the brain. At the NPS, computer scientist and neurobiologist had worked together for several years. From that association had come FormQ, and programs like George and Martha, the new psychosurgical techniques in Psychodex. Psychodex was relatively simple. It was a test that took straightforward answers to psychological questions and manipulated the answers according to complex mathematical formulations. As the data was fed into the computer, Ross watched the screen glow with row after row of calculations. She ignored them. The numbers she knew were just the computer's scratch pad, the intermediate steps that it went through before arriving at a final answer. She smiled, thinking of how Gerhard would explain it. Rotation of 30 by 30 matrices in space, deriving factors, making them orthogonal, and then weighing them. It all sounded complicated and scientific, and she didn't really understand any of it. She had discovered long ago that you could use a computer without understanding how it worked, just as you could use an automobile, a vacuum cleaner, or your own brain. The screen flashed, calculations ended, call display sequence. She punched in the display sequence for 3-space scoring. The computer informed her that 3 spaces accounted for 81% of variance. On the screen, she saw a 3-dimensional image of a mountain with a sharp peak. She stared at it a moment, then picked up the telephone and paged McPherson. McPherson frowned at the screen. Ellis looked over his shoulder. Ross said, "Is it clear?" "Perfectly," McPherson said. "When was it done?" "Today," she said. McPherson sighed. "You're not going to quit without a battle, are you?" Instead of answering, she punched buttons and called up a second mountain peak, much lower. Here's the last one previously. On this scoring, the elevation is psychotic mentation, she said. "So he's much more pronounced now," McPherson said. Much more than even a month ago." "Yes," she said. "You think he was screwing around with the test?" She shook her head. She punched in the 4 previous tests in succession. The trend was clear. On each test, the mountain peak got higher and sharper. "Well then," McPherson said, "he's definitely getting worse. I gather you still think we shouldn't operate?" "More than ever," she said. "He's unquestionably psychotic. And if you start putting wires in his head, I know what you're saying. He's going to feel that he's been turned into a machine," she said. McPherson turned to Ellis. "Do you suppose we can knock the elevation down with Thorazine?" Thorazine was a major tranquilizer, with some psychotics. It helped them to think more clearly. "I think it's worth a try," McPherson nodded. "I do too, Janet." "I do too. Janet?" She stared at the screen and didn't reply. It was odd how these tests worked. The mountain peaks were an abstraction, a mathematical representation of an emotional state. They weren't a real characteristic of a person, like fingers or toes or height or weight. "Janet, what do you think?" McPherson repeated. "I think," she said, "that you're both committed to this operation, and you still disapprove." "I don't disapprove. I think it's unwise for Benson." "What do you think about using Thorazine?" McPherson persisted. "It's a gamble not worth taking. Maybe it's worth it, and maybe it's not, but it's a gamble." McPherson nodded and turned to Ellis. "Do you still want to do him?" "Yes," Ellis said, staring at the screen. "I still want to do him."